enhanced supplementary leverage ratio. I do appreciate the Federal Reserve's efforts, and I hope we can continue an open dialogue on these changes as you move forward. I'm just curious, you indicated with regard to Senator Reid's question, based on the tax bill, clearly there's an improvement in GDP growth over the last couple of years. Was it anticipation of the tax bill being passed? I'd like to flesh that out just a little bit, because most certainly I think a lot of us truly believe that tax bill is a key component in the development of an improvement in our GDP. Your thoughts?
So I was really answering about whether you could see it in wages right now, and I thought it was hard to do. I think, so growth averaged around 2% for 8 years, and then 2017 it was, I think the current estimate is 2.6%. And you saw significant improvements in household and business confidence levels, overall confidence about the economy. You saw that coming on in 2017. Some of that was probably in anticipation of the passage of what finally passed. So that was already in the growth rate. I think it's hard to say, but I suspect that some anticipation of tax cuts and tax reform was already in the growth in 2017. Going forward, we've said this, we expect, there are a range of estimates on this, but we would expect that the tax bill and the spending bill would provide meaningful support to demand for at least the next 2 or 3 years, maybe 3 years, and also might have effects on the supply side as well. To the extent you're encouraging more investment, you're going to get higher productivity. So these estimates are subject to tremendous uncertainty, both as to amount as to timing. But I think we look at the range of estimates, and that's certainly where we broadly come out.
I just want to be clear. That tax bill had a positive impact. Even if it's the anticipation of the tax bill, it had a positive impact on our GDP growth, correct?
Yes, I think so. This year, maybe last year too.
Okay, let me ask you this. With regard to trade, you make note specifically in your comments on trade and the fact that there are some things up in the air right now. There is some perhaps instability or some questions on the part of not only our businesses, but businesses around the world. Are businesses looking for stability with regard to trade compacts, or are they looking for opportunity and instability?
Well, they clearly be looking for stability.
Okay. And then I would like to associate myself, and I support what Senator Scott indicated earlier with regard to the insurance issues and the fact that our state-based regulatory system for insurance, I think, is critical. I think it's a positive thing for consumers when it's as close to that state regulatory process as possible. When you came here before the committee earlier this year, you discussed capital requirements in the options market and mentioned that the Federal Reserve was working on a rule to transition from the risk-insensitive current exposure method, or SEM, to the internationally agreed-upon standardized approach for counterparty credit risk, SACR. I'm supportive of these efforts, but I remain concerned about the timeline for implementation. I noted with concern in a letter to Vice Chair Quarles last year, in response to my request that the Federal Reserve use its reservation of authority to grant interim relief, Vice Chair Quarles asserted that the Fed lacks such authority in this context. I originally raised this issue when Vice Chair Quarles was testifying at his confirmation hearing last July. Unfortunately, it's been a year since that time, and the Fed has yet to take meaningful action. I remain concerned about this because the longer we wait for American regulators to implement SACR, the more market makers will exit the options market entirely, making our financial system more vulnerable to economic shocks and less competitive compared to our international peers. I noted in the Basel Committee's last progress report from April of 2018 that 22 of the 27 Basel member countries have either implemented SACR or made substantially more progress at implementation compared to the United States. I'm a particularly strong supporter of a risk-based capital standards, particularly in this context in options markets. Can you provide an update on when the rulemaking from SEM to SACR will be released?
I know that we're working on it now. I know that we think it's good policy. And I can't give you an exact date, but I know we're actively drafting a rule. And by not being able to provide interim relief, all we meant was we actually have to amend the rule. So we'll be putting a rule out for proposal and get comments, and then it'll go final. But it's in train, but these things take time. We're working on it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here. Lately, we've heard a near constant refrain from the administration, the president himself, corporate media outlets, and even from you, that, quote, the economy is doing very well, and, quote, it's never been better. Now, if we take a narrow view of the unemployment rate and corporate profits, then sure, it's a real rosy picture. But take a wider lens to what working families are seeing, and the view is one of great contrast. Over the last year, despite falling unemployment, working families actually saw their real wages fall. By comparison, after-tax corporate profits increased by 8.7% just in the last quarter. There's something fundamentally wrong in our economy when workers are seeing their pay cut while corporations are benefiting from a $2 trillion tax giveaway. Working families not only can't get ahead, but they're actually falling behind. I can tell you, families in New Jersey can't keep up with the surging costs, particularly for prescription drugs and health care. I just heard from a constituent in Glendora, New Jersey, who told me that even with his Medicare and secondary insurance, he can't afford to pay for his insulin and diabetes equipment, and that's pretty unconscionable. So my question to you, Mrs. Chairman, is when will the benefits of this, quote, booming economy reach working families?
Thank you, Senator. I think we're aware, and I'm aware, that while the aggregate numbers are good and unemployment is low and surveys overall of households are very positive about the job market, not everybody is experiencing the recovery. Not every demographic group, not every place are experiencing this. So we call that out in our, in every FOMC meeting and in all of our public communications, as I did in my testimony this morning. And, we understand that we have to take maximum employment seriously, and we do. I mean, we've been supporting a strong labor market for a long time, despite many calls for us to raise interest rates much more quickly. I'm glad that we stayed in longer than that, and I think gradually raising rates is the way for us to extend this expansion. Nothing hurts working families and people at the margin of the labor markets more than a recession.
Well, you're probably going to have a couple more interest rates. What specific steps, then, are you taking to foster broad-based wage growth so that the average worker, not just managers and executives, are reaping the benefits? I mean, I can't accept that wages are growing when the Bureau of Labor Statistics points out that production and non-supervisory workers saw their wages fall 0.2%, and that's despite increasing their average work week to make up for it, so they're getting squeezed.
So the latest government report was that wages went up 2.7% for production, non-supervisory workers, and supervisory workers over the last 12 months. So, and that's higher, that's moving up. It also happens that inflation has moved up and that a sort of a bump in energy prices is passing through the headline inflation number. So I think overall, though, you see inflation at about a 2% trend. You see wages at 2.7%. So I think those trends are healthy, and I think they're reflected in what are pretty positive surveys among workers generally.
Let me ask you this. These working families we're talking about are the first to feel the impact when banks, big banks and corporations take risky bets with no accountability. When we passed Dodd-Frank, we included language to ban incentive-based compensation practices that reward senior executives for irresponsible risk-taking. Regulators issued a proposal in 2016, but more than 2 years later, nothing has been finalized. In the meantime, Wall Street bonuses jumped 17% last year to an average of more than $184,000, the most since 2006, and that's bonuses alone. Now, you have made time to weaken Wall Street oversight by revisiting capital rules, revisiting leverage rules, proposing changes to the VOCA rule, all of which were finalized after years of deliberation, public comments, and input from other regulators, and all of which protect our economy from another financial crisis. How is it, Mr. Chairman, that you have not made time to finish the incentive-based compensation rulemaking for the first time? And can you give me a commitment today as to a timeline for when this will be done?
We tried for many years. It's a multi-agency rule, the incentive comp rule. We were not able to achieve consensus over a period of many years between the various regulatory agencies that need to sign off on that. But that didn't stop us from acting. You should know. Particularly for the largest institutions, we do expect that they will have in place compensation plans that do not provide incentives for excessive risk-taking. And we expect that the Board of Directors will make sure that that's the case. And so it's not something that we haven't done. We've, in fact, moved ahead through supervisory practice to make sure that these things are better than they were, and they're substantially better than they were. You see much better compensation practices here, focusing mainly on the big firms where the problem really was.
Well, that does not have the power of a rule. I hope we can get to a rule-based purpose, because at the end of the day, we seem to have revisited everything that was already completed, but yet we cannot get this one going. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Corker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here. I was remarking to our staff yesterday as we talked a little bit about this meeting that because of the way that you're handling yourself, which I think is in a very positive way, following the Fed is getting really boring these days. But hopefully that will continue. I know that's your goal. We appreciate some of the transparency efforts that you put forth. I think I heard you earlier talk about inflation, and obviously we're at full employment. Hopefully there'll be additional people participating in the workforce that have not in the past, and I'm glad to see those numbers are rising. But if I understand correctly what you're saying, the predictive stat for people who are watching the Fed today will be core inflation. In other words, that will be the determinative factor as it relates to rate increases in the future.
So we, of course, look at headline inflation, too, and that's our legal mandate. We look at core inflation when we're thinking about the path of future inflation, though, because it's just a better predictor.
Yeah.
Many of the things that affect headline inflation don't actually send much of a signal about future inflation.
But for people who are trying to see where things are going, now that the labor issue where it is today, the predictive matter as it relates to future increases and the amount of those is really going to be inflation.
Inflation is going to be really important. You know, I think we're for quite a while here, we've been in the range of achieving our maximum employment goal, and we're only just getting there with inflation. Yeah. I think I wouldn't declare victory on that yet either.
Yeah, it's really been difficult, I think, for many Western countries to get to a place that they're comfortable in inflation, which brings me to the wage issue. Look, I like my colleagues. I'm very concerned about wage stagnation, and I'm not in any way trying to offload that issue to you. We all have responsibilities to put in place policies that will hopefully cause all Americans' wages to increase. But what we're seeing here, and what we're seeing actually, let's face it, in Western countries around the world, is people are not, the anticipations that people had relative to where they were going to be in life is not being achieved, which is creating some extremes as it relates to the political environment, actually in some ways beginning to destabilize because people are rightly so concerned about the fact that they're not really increasing the ability to raise their families as they wish. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, what is it from your perspective that is causing us to be in this place where the economy is growing, but for the last 30 years, Americans really haven't seen the wage gains that they'd like to see? Could you just lay out, not in any way to take responsibility at the Fed,